Emma had never been the type to believe in things that went bump in the night. The noises she occasionally heard, the creaks and groans of an old house settling, were just part of the charm, the things that made a home feel lived in. So when she moved into the quaint two-story cottage nestled on the edge of town, she wasn't expecting anything to be unusual. She and Buddy, her golden retriever, were going to start fresh in this peaceful setting. The house had been on the market for months, and Emma had snatched it up for a steal. There was something about it though, something that called to her. Maybe it was the vintage wallpaper, or the worn-down wood floors that seemed to tell stories with every step she took. It felt like home the moment she walked in, and Buddy, as always, was there beside her, wagging his tail, eager to explore. The first few days were idyllic. Emma unpacked boxes and set up the living room, while Buddy followed her everywhere, sniffing every corner as if to make sure nothing had been missed. He had always been a friendly dog, not one to bark much, but he was loyal, a real protector, especially when it came to Emma. She had adopted him from a shelter years ago, and he had been her constant companion ever since. One evening, after a long day of settling in, Emma sank into the worn-out couch in the living room, tired but content. Buddy curled up beside her, his head resting on her lap as she absent-mindedly ran her fingers through his soft fur. She watched the flickering shadows dance across the walls, a gentle fire crackling in the hearth. The perfect evening. But as the night grew late, Emma noticed something strange. Buddy had stopped resting. His ears were perked, his eyes fixed on a spot in the far corner of the living room. He was growling softly, low and menacing, a sound Emma had never heard from him before. His eyes never wavered from that corner, and a shiver ran down Emma's spine. "Buddy, stop it," she said, a laugh escaping her lips. "There's nothing there. You're being dramatic." But Buddy didn't stop. His growl deepened, and his body tensed, ready to spring into action. Emma's heart began to race, but she quickly dismissed it as nothing more than a figment of her imagination. Maybe the house's unfamiliar creaks were playing tricks on her. She reached down to pet Buddy, but he pulled away, still staring intently at the empty corner. "Come on, Buddy," she said, her voice a little shakier than she intended. "It's just a house. Nothing's going to hurt you." She patted his head again, but this time Buddy didn't relax. He remained on edge, his gaze never leaving the corner. It was as if something unseen was standing there, watching him. Emma finally stood, grabbing Buddy's collar and guiding him away from the corner. "You're being silly," she muttered. But deep down, something wasn't right. She didn't know why, but she couldn't shake the feeling that there was something in that corner, something that didn't belong. But as soon as she was distracted by something else, the feeling passed. It had to be the stress of moving, she told herself. Buddy was probably just adjusting to the new surroundings too. Later that night, when Emma crawled into bed and Buddy snuggled at her feet, she tried to put the strange incident out of her mind. As sleep began to settle over her, she allowed herself to relax. She would face the day tomorrow, deal with the unpacking, and soon enough, everything would feel like home. Yet, as the moonlight filtered through the curtains, Emma couldn't ignore the unease creeping up her spine. The house, despite its beauty, seemed different than the others she had lived in. It had a presence of its own, something that felt heavy in the air, something she couldn't quite explain. Buddy shifted at her feet, letting out a low, almost imperceptible whine. His usual comfort in her presence was gone. Emma sat up, feeling a rush of concern wash over her. "Buddy," she whispered. Buddy's eyes flickered open, and he raised his head, staring straight ahead, his body tense. Emma followed his gaze but saw nothing. There was nothing there. She took a deep breath, and shook her head. "It's just the house settling," she muttered to herself. But even as she said the words, she couldn't shake the gnawing feeling in the pit of her stomach. The days that followed were an endless blur of unpacking, setting up, and adjusting. Emma had hoped that the strange feeling from that first night would fade, but instead, it only grew stronger. Every corner of the house seemed to have a life of its own, and Buddy's behavior was becoming increasingly erratic. Emma couldn't explain it. He was acting like a dog possessed, but not in the way she was used to. It wasn't that Buddy was scared of things. He was a confident, well-adjusted dog, but now he seemed to be on edge all the time, as if something unseen was stalking the house. At first, it was subtle, small things. Buddy's reluctance to go into certain rooms, his constant need to check the front door as if expecting someone, his unsettling growls at empty spaces in the living room. Emma thought it was just his way of adjusting to a new place. She reassured herself that it was nothing more than the typical signs of a dog getting used to a new environment. But with each passing night, Buddy's behavior became more alarming. It was as though he was trying to communicate something Emma couldn't see. He started growling more frequently, often staring at the same spot in the corner of the living room, his fur standing on end. Emma had tried to call him off, telling him there was nothing there, but the more she dismissed his behavior, the worse it became. Buddy's growl turned into a constant, low rumble that sent chills up Emma's spine. She could feel it in the pit of her stomach, that gnawing fear, even though she had no logical explanation for it. Then it started to get worse. One night, as she sat on the couch scrolling through her phone, Buddy began to act as if he couldn't get comfortable. He paced in circles around the room, his eyes darting from one corner to the next. He barked once, sharp and insistent, then stopped abruptly, his body stiffening. Emma watched him carefully, her heart beginning to race. "Buddy," she called softly, but he ignored her. Without warning, Buddy leapt onto the couch beside her, pressing his body close, his trembling form causing her to pause. His paws dug into the cushions, as if he were trying to climb onto her lap. Emma gently stroked his fur, trying to calm him, but the dog was having none of it. He pawed at her, urging her to get up, his eyes wide with panic. "Buddy, what's going on?" Emma muttered, her voice thick with confusion and a touch of annoyance. She had never seen him like this. It was as though he knew something she didn't, something she couldn't see, and that thought unsettled her even more. Suddenly, Buddy began to growl again, this time louder, more frantic. His body shook, his tail tucked low between his legs, as he desperately pawed at her sleeve. The growls turned into frantic barks, and he lunged toward the door. Emma jumped to her feet, following him. She watched as Buddy's behavior escalated. He started barking at the wall as if something, or someone, was right there in front of him. "What the hell, Buddy?" Emma hissed, her mind racing. She tried to pull him away, but he refused to budge. His eyes never left the wall. The sound of his barks echoed in the stillness of the night, rattling her nerves. Emma's frustration finally boiled over. She reached down to grab Buddy's collar, but he yanked away, growling more fiercely than before. "Stop it, Buddy. You're scaring me." She dragged him to the bedroom, locking the door behind them, hoping that a change of scenery would calm him down. But Buddy wasn't finished. He stood at the door, scratching furiously at it, barking incessantly. "You're acting crazy," Emma yelled, her voice thick with exasperation. "There's nothing there, Buddy. There's nothing to be afraid of." But deep down, Emma knew it wasn't that simple. Buddy was reacting to something she couldn't understand, and the more she tried to dismiss it, the more intense his behavior became. It wasn't just the growling, the incessant scratching at the door, or the way he refused to sleep. It was the feeling that something was terribly wrong. That night, as Emma lay in bed, trying to block out the sounds of Buddy's scratching at the door, she couldn't sleep. She tossed and turned, her thoughts racing. What was happening? Was it just stress from moving, or was there something more to it? She stared at the ceiling, her mind unable to settle, until finally exhaustion took over. But even in sleep, she was uneasy, aware of the ever-present feeling that she wasn't alone. The next day was no better. Buddy had barely slept, his eyes wide and unfocused, his body still tense. Emma had called the vet, but they couldn't find anything physically wrong with him. The vet suggested it might be anxiety, or the stress of the move, but Emma wasn't convinced. She couldn't shake the feeling that Buddy was reacting to something far beyond her understanding. Later that afternoon, Emma sat at the kitchen table, trying to do some work. Buddy was nowhere to be seen, which was unusual. She called out to him, but heard nothing in return. Panic bubbled up in her chest as she walked through the house, calling his name. She finally found him in the living room, standing in front of the same corner he had been so obsessed with the night before. His eyes were locked on it once more, his body rigid, his growl low and steady. Emma swallowed hard. This wasn't normal. There was something wrong, something that Buddy knew, and that she didn't. She walked over to him slowly, her heart pounding in her chest. She tried to pull him away, but he wouldn't budge. He stood there, frozen, staring intently at the corner, as if daring her to see what he saw. "Buddy, please," she whispered, her voice quivering. "What's going on?" But Buddy didn't answer. Of course, he could only growl in response, the sound so primal that it seemed to echo through the house, resonating deep in her bones. It was as if he was trying to protect her, trying to warn her of something that was right there, something invisible, but dangerous. And then, without warning, Buddy turned and bolted toward the door, whining frantically as he scratched at it. Emma watched in stunned silence, unsure of what to do. Her logical mind told her it was just a dog acting up, but her instincts told her something else entirely. There was a presence in the house, something she couldn't see, but that Buddy clearly sensed. Her head swirled with confusion, fear, and frustration. "What do you want me to do, Buddy?" she whispered into the empty room. "I don't know what's happening." Emma's patience was wearing thin. The bizarre behavior from Buddy had gone on long enough. She had tried everything, talking to him, reassuring him, even taking him to the vet to rule out any medical issues. But nothing seemed to change. The growling, the frantic scratching at the door, the inability to sleep, everything was spiraling out of control. She had tried to maintain some semblance of normalcy, but each day felt like she was walking on eggshells, never knowing when Buddy's next episode would hit. He had become a shadow of the dog she once knew, constantly agitated, hyper-aware, and increasingly difficult to calm. The nightmarish growls in the dark, the fearful whimpers as he watched empty spaces, his refusal to sleep next to her, everything had shifted. Emma felt as though she was living in a nightmare that she couldn't wake from. The final straw came one particularly tense evening. Emma had spent the entire day working from home, trying to focus on her assignments, but it was impossible. The house felt suffocating. Every time she tried to concentrate, Buddy's anxious pacing, his constant whimpering, and his guttural growls in the corners of the rooms pulled her back into the chaos. Her mind was frayed, and she hadn't gotten a solid night's sleep in weeks. She was running on fumes, her nerves stretched too thin to function properly. She had reached her breaking point. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the living room, Emma snapped. She stood up abruptly, her frustration boiling over. "There's nothing there." "What's wrong with you, Buddy?" she shouted, her voice rising with the weight of all her unspoken fears, her exhaustion, and her confusion. Buddy froze mid-growl, his eyes wide and confused, as if shocked by her outburst. But Emma was past reason. Her mind was a storm, a swirling vortex of terror, anger, and helplessness. She had tried to be patient, she had tried to be understanding, but now, the relentless growling, the scratching at the door, the refusal to sleep, it had all pushed her to the edge. Her once loving companion, the dog who had been her constant source of comfort and loyalty, had become something unrecognizable, and she didn't know how to help him, or herself. "You've been acting like this for weeks," she continued, her voice trembling with emotion. "What am I supposed to do? I don't know what's wrong with you anymore. Why won't you listen to me?" Tears blurred her vision, but Emma wiped them away quickly, unwilling to break down in front of Buddy. She locked eyes with him, her heart aching. The pain of seeing him in this state, this fearful, frantic state, was almost unbearable. Buddy, for his part, only seemed to recoil further. His tail tucked between his legs, he cowered slightly, as if afraid of her. The sight sent a sharp stab of guilt through Emma's chest, but she couldn't stop herself. She felt powerless, lost, and trapped in a situation that made no sense. What was happening? Why was Buddy acting like this? She had tried to dismiss it as stress, but deep down, she knew something wasn't right. Something was out of their control. In a burst of frustration, Emma rushed to the bedroom, slamming the door behind her. She needed a moment alone, a moment to breathe, to calm down. She couldn't take it anymore. The house felt like it was closing in on her, its walls pressing against her chest, suffocating her. Buddy's frantic scratching at the door echoed through the room, the sound sharp and relentless. She could hear him whimpering from the other side, and it broke her heart. She had never seen him like this. He wasn't the playful dog who loved to run in the park. He wasn't the loyal companion who would sit by her side through thick and thin. No, this was a dog driven to madness by something he couldn't explain. And she, the one who should have been his protector, was at a loss as to what was happening. Emma sat on the edge of the bed, her head in her hands, fighting to control her breathing. The weight of the situation pressed down on her like a vice, and she felt herself spiraling into despair. She didn't know what to do anymore. Should she leave? Should she take Buddy and run? But where would they go? This house, this place that had promised them peace and comfort, was becoming their prison. Her thoughts were interrupted by a sudden forceful bang on the door, followed by Buddy's barking, louder now, more urgent. He wasn't going to stop. He wasn't going to give up. He was trying to tell her something, but what? With trembling hands, Emma stood up and unlocked the door, her heart hammering in her chest. She opened it just enough to see Buddy's desperate face, his eyes wide with fear. His body was tense, his muscles tight as he stared into the dark hallway, his attention fixed on something she couldn't see. His growls were now a deep, guttural sound, as if whatever he was sensing had crossed some invisible boundary. "Buddy," she whispered, her voice breaking. "What is it? What do you see?" But Buddy didn't answer. Of course, he couldn't. He could only react, bark, growl, scratch at the door, all in an attempt to warn her, to protect her. But there was no explanation, no reason for the madness. It was as though they were both trapped in some nightmare, with no escape. Finally, Emma snapped. She couldn't take it anymore. She pushed past Buddy, grabbing him by the collar and yanking him into the bedroom. She shut the door behind them, her pulse racing as she collapsed onto the bed, her breath coming in shallow gasps. She felt like she was suffocating. "I'm sorry," she whispered through tears. "I'm sorry, Buddy. I don't know what's happening. I don't know what to do." Buddy, for the first time in what felt like forever, seemed to calm down. He sat beside her, his head resting on her lap, his body trembling as if he could finally sense her fear and frustration. She ran her fingers through his fur, her tears soaking into his coat. He licked her hand gently, as if forgiving her for her outburst. The connection they shared, the bond they had built over the years, felt fragile now. Emma knew she had almost lost it. She had almost broken, and for a moment she wondered if it was too late to fix things. Could they go back to the way things had been? Could she find a way to calm Buddy, to reassure him that everything was going to be okay? But in her heart she knew that things would never be the same. The house had changed them both. The invisible presence that seemed to lurk in the corners of every room was no longer something she could ignore. And Buddy, her faithful companion, was the only one who had seen it for what it truly was. She looked down at him, her chest tightening with a mixture of love and dread. There was no turning back now. They were in this together. Whatever was happening, whatever darkness was lurking in the corners of the house, they would face it head on. Emma made a silent promise to herself and to Buddy that she would protect him, no matter what it took. And in that moment she realized that they were no longer just dealing with an unsettling house. They were facing something much bigger, something that neither of them could fully comprehend. Emma's world had been turned upside down. She could no longer go about her day without a constant heavy weight pressing on her chest. It felt like she was on the edge of something, always teetering between fear and disbelief, between what she knew and what she could not understand. Buddy's behavior was worsening with each passing day. He had become more than just a dog acting out of stress or confusion. He had become an unwilling guide, trying to show her something that she wasn't ready to see. But what was it? The strange occurrences continued to escalate. Emma would wake up to find Buddy standing by her bed, staring at the empty corner of the room, his eyes wide, his body rigid. He would growl softly, a low rumble in his chest, as if whatever he was seeing in the dark was not only terrifying but incredibly dangerous. There was no explanation for his behavior, no logical reason why he acted the way he did. And every time she tried to dismiss it as nothing more than a dog's anxious quirks, she felt herself being pulled deeper into a web of unease. Her home, once a place of peace, now felt like a trap, with Buddy becoming the only sign that something was wrong. The frustration had begun to eat away at her. She had tried everything, researched potential behavioral issues in dogs, considered anxiety, even consulted her vet again, But nothing had worked. The mystery deepened as Buddy's obsession with certain areas of the house grew. There was a particular corner in the living room, a spot where the shadows seemed to gather more than anywhere else, that held his attention. He would sit there for hours, staring into the space as if it was the most important thing in the world. And the growls, those low, ominous growls, became more frequent, more persistent. Emma's exhaustion had started to cloud her thoughts. She hadn't been sleeping properly for weeks, and every night felt like a battle to stay awake, to stay alert, to keep herself grounded in some semblance of reality. But the line between what was real and what was not had begun to blur. One afternoon, after another sleepless night, Emma sat down with her laptop, trying to get some work done. The house felt strangely quiet, but the silence was heavy, oppressive. Buddy was nowhere to be found, which was unlike him. He was always nearby, either at her feet or by her side, but today he was absent. She figured he was just off exploring the yard, trying to find some peace outside, so she tried to focus on her work. But it wasn't long before a strange sound broke her concentration, a soft whimper, followed by the unmistakable scratching of Buddy's paws against the door. She stood up, heart racing, and walked toward the living room, where she found him standing motionless by the door, eyes locked on the same corner he had been so obsessed with for weeks. It was the first time in a while that Buddy wasn't growling. Instead, he was eerily still, his posture tense, as if waiting for something. Emma felt her breath catch in her throat as she approached him. "What is it, Buddy?" she whispered, her voice barely above a murmur. But Buddy didn't respond. He simply stood there, motionless, as if he were guarding the doorway to something unknown. Without thinking, Emma walked over to the spot he had been watching so intently. The corner was empty, as it had always been. It looked no different from any other part of the room. Nothing out of the ordinary, nothing that should have caused such distress. But as she stood there, something shifted in the air. The hairs on the back of her neck stood up, and she felt a sudden, inexplicable chill wash over her. It wasn't just a draft. It felt colder, deeper, as if the very atmosphere had changed. Emma took a deep breath, willing herself to stay calm, but her heart was pounding in her chest. "Nothing's here," she muttered to herself, trying to shake off the unease that had settled in her bones. "You're being ridiculous, Emma." She glanced back at Buddy, who still hadn't moved. His eyes were fixed on her, pleading, as if asking her to see something that she couldn't. It was in that moment that Emma realized he wasn't just watching the corner, he was watching her. And whatever was there, whatever he was so terrified of, wasn't just something he sensed, it was something that was connected to her. A flash of instinct ran through Emma's mind, and she pulled her gaze away from the corner, her heart now racing. It was as if she had been standing on the edge of a cliff, and the instant she looked down, she realized just how high up she was. She had been so focused on Buddy's strange behavior that she hadn't considered what might be happening to her own body. She quickly glanced around the room, searching for any sign of what was going wrong. That's when her eyes landed on her laptop. It was sitting innocently on the coffee table, the screen open to a website she had been reading earlier that morning. But there was something about the title that caught her eye. It wasn't the article she remembered reading, but an older one, a link she must have clicked by accident. Radon gas, the silent killer. The words hit her like a punch to the gut. Radon gas. She had heard of it before, but never paid much attention. It was a colorless, odorless gas that seeped from the ground, potentially causing lung cancer in high concentrations. She quickly clicked the link, reading through the article in a blur. Her eyes scanned the text, her mind processing the information in a frantic rush. Radon gas was known to be one of the leading causes of lung cancer, and it often went undetected because there were no immediate symptoms, no smell, no visible signs, nothing to indicate its presence. The more she read, the more her heart sank. Everything in the article pointed to the symptoms of someone being exposed to high levels of radon gas. Headaches, dizziness, fatigue, shortness of breath, and even a general feeling of unease. But what caught her attention was the mention of pets. Animals, particularly dogs, had an incredible ability to sense certain chemicals and gases that humans couldn't detect. Buddy's erratic behavior, his growling at the empty corner, his frantic scratching at the door. It all started to make sense. Emma's hands began to shake as she scrolled down. She clicked another link, this one to a site offering radon testing kits, and her mind raced with possibilities. Could it be? Was this why Buddy had been acting so strange? Could the gas be affecting her too, and she just hadn't noticed it? She needed answers. She needed to know if she was living in a toxic environment, if the house she thought would be her sanctuary was actually poisoning her. Without a second thought, she grabbed her car keys and rushed out of the house, Buddy trailing behind her, still frantic but now almost as if he sensed she was onto something. Emma drove to the hardware store, her mind spinning, her thoughts a blur of fear and disbelief. She picked up the radon test kit and rushed back to the house, praying that it wasn't too late. That night, after Buddy had calmed down slightly, Emma set up the test in the living room, following the instructions carefully. She was terrified, but at the same time, a small part of her felt a glimmer of hope. If this test confirmed her suspicions, at least she would know what was wrong. She would have something to point to, a reason for Buddy's strange behavior, a way to fix it. The next morning, she checked the test results, and her heart sank. The reading was off the charts. Emma sat down slowly, her mind numb with shock. She had known deep down that something wasn't right, but to see it confirmed in black and white was almost too much to bear. Radon gas, silent, deadly, and undetectable to the human senses, had been slowly seeping into her home, poisoning the air she breathed, and making her and Buddy sick. She sat on the floor, Buddy by her side, and let the gravity of the situation wash over her. She had been living in a death trap, and it was Buddy, her loyal companion, who had been trying to warn her all along. Emma's heart pounded as she sat there, staring at the radon test kit, results in disbelief. The realization settled on her like a heavy weight. All this time, days, weeks, months, she had been living in a house that was slowly suffocating her. And it wasn't just her. Buddy, her loyal dog, had been warning her all along. He wasn't just reacting to something he couldn't see, but to something far more insidious, something that had been silently poisoning them both. Emma's head swam with the gravity of it all. How had she not realized sooner? How had she dismissed Buddy's frantic growls and the increasingly strange behavior as nothing more than the quirks of a stressed dog? The house, once a peaceful retreat, had become a prison, a ticking time bomb that was slowly stealing their lives away. Emma's eyes welled with tears as she glanced down at Buddy, who lay at her feet, his head resting on her lap, his body still tense but no longer frantic. He had tried to warn her, to get her attention, but she had been so wrapped up in her own confusion and frustration that she hadn't been able to hear him. As the reality of the situation began to settle in, Emma knew that she had to act quickly. The radon levels were dangerously high. The fire department had already confirmed that it was a severe leak, and without immediate action, the consequences could be fatal. She could no longer stay in the house. She could no longer pretend that everything was going to be okay. But the thought of leaving, of abandoning the place that had once felt like home, twisted her gut in a way she wasn't prepared for. This house had been her sanctuary, her fresh start. It had been the place where she hoped to rebuild her life, where she thought she would find peace. And now it was the very thing threatening to take everything from her. Buddy whined softly, lifting his head to nuzzle her hand as if sensing the turmoil swirling inside her. Emma stroked his fur, feeling the familiar warmth of his body, the comforting presence that had always been there to support her. She had always been the one to protect him, to look out for him, but now he was the one who had saved her, saved them both. She had almost ignored him, almost let him down. The guilt that gnawed at her was overwhelming. She had never wanted to doubt him, but she had been so caught up in the noise of her own life that she hadn't heard the quiet warning he had been giving her. Emma stood abruptly, pacing the length of the living room. The house felt even more suffocating now that she knew what was truly happening inside it. Her thoughts raced. What should she do? How could she get out of here before it was too late? She grabbed her phone, her hands trembling as she dialed the fire department. The conversation was brief, but it felt like an eternity. The inspector on the other end of the line confirmed what she had already feared. The radon levels in her home were dangerously high. If you had stayed in there much longer, you'd be dead, the inspector said grimly. His words felt like a slap to the face, a harsh reminder of how close she had come to losing everything. Her mind flashed to the nights when Buddy had been so agitated, so desperate to get her out of the bedroom, away from the walls that were silently killing her. She had ignored him, told him to stop being dramatic, when all along he had been trying to save her life. Get out of there, the inspector urged. Don't go back inside until we can fix it. You need to leave right now. The weight of his words hung heavily in the air. Emma swallowed hard, her throat tight as she looked at Buddy. She couldn't stay here, not when her life was at risk, not when Buddy's life was at risk. She had to leave. With a sense of urgency she hadn't felt before, Emma grabbed her purse, her phone, and her keys, rushing through the house, her mind a whirlwind of fear and disbelief. She opened the door, stepping outside into the cool air, and paused for a moment. The sun had already dipped below the horizon, casting the neighborhood in an eerie twilight. The streets, usually filled with life, were now quiet, the silence echoing the emptiness that Emma felt inside. She could hear Buddy's paws tapping on the floor behind her as he followed her outside, his tail wagging slightly, his energy now subdued, but still present. As they stood in the front yard, Emma looked back at the house, her heart heavy with a mixture of emotions. She had never expected this. She had never imagined that the place she had chosen to start fresh would turn into a nightmare. But as she stood there, she realized that she had made the right decision. She had to leave. She had to keep herself and Buddy safe. She started the car, the engine roaring to life as the sound cut through the quiet night. Emma glanced at Buddy, who was now lying in the back seat, his head resting on the window, watching the world pass by. He seemed calm now, but Emma knew that the past few weeks had taken their toll on him. She couldn't help but feel a deep sense of gratitude toward him. He had saved her life, and now she was going to do everything in her power to make sure they both survived this. The drive felt long, even though it was only a few miles to her friend's house. Emma tried to focus on the road, to keep her thoughts from spiraling, but her mind kept drifting back to the house. It felt like a distant memory, a dream she had woken from, and yet the terror of those final days lingered in her chest. She couldn't believe how close she had come to disaster. She had come so close to losing everything, her life, her health, her home, and Buddy. But as she drove, she found herself clinging to one truth. Buddy had been right. Buddy had known what was happening when she couldn't see it, when she couldn't understand it. And if it weren't for him, if it weren't for his persistence and his determination to protect her, she might never have realized the danger she was in. By the time they reached her friend's house, Emma felt drained, her body exhausted, but her mind still racing. She parked the car in the driveway and turned off the engine, sitting for a moment in silence. Buddy, sensing her distress, moved to the front seat, resting his head in her lap. She ran her fingers through his fur, the motion automatic, soothing, grounding. She didn't have the words to express what she was feeling. There were no words for the gratitude she felt, no way to fully explain the depth of her relief. She simply held him, knowing that they had both escaped something terrible. Emma knew it wasn't over. The house, the danger, the radon, it was still out there, and there was a long road ahead of them to make things right. But for now she was safe, and Buddy was safe, and that was all that mattered. The world felt surreal as Emma and Buddy stood outside, away from the suffocating grip of the house that had nearly cost them everything. The night air, cool and crisp, felt like a breath of life, something Emma hadn't realized she needed until that very moment. She had never understood how much she had been holding her breath until she could finally exhale. But as the inspector's words echoed in her mind, the reality of what she had almost lost was suffocating her once again. If you had stayed another week, you'd be dead. The inspector's voice replayed over and over in her head. Those words struck with the force of a hammer to her chest. How had she not known? How had she been so oblivious to the slow, invisible killer that had been silently seeping into her home? Radon gas, colorless, odorless, and completely undetectable by human senses, had been filling her home for months, and she hadn't noticed a single thing until Buddy had nearly driven her to the edge of her sanity. It was impossible to fathom just how close she had come to disaster. The house had felt like a sanctuary to her, a fresh start after the chaos of her past. But now, with the weight of the truth crashing down on her, Emma realized how easily everything could have been taken from her. She could still hear Buddy's soft whimpering in the back seat of the car, a sound that pulled her out of her thoughts and back to the present. She glanced at him through the rearview mirror, her heart aching. Buddy had always been there for her, her protector, her constant companion, and now, in the face of something she could barely understand, he had saved her life. She couldn't stop thinking about all those nights when Buddy had been on edge, growling at the empty corners of the room, his anxiety reaching unbearable levels. At the time, she had chalked it up to a dog's quirks, just a nervous, stressed animal adjusting to a new environment. But Buddy had known. He had sensed the danger long before she had even thought to consider the possibility of a deadly radon leak. Emma's mind drifted back to the beginning of it all, the moment when Buddy had first started growling at the living room corner, his behavior shifting from playful and relaxed to paranoid and fearful. She had laughed it off, convinced that Buddy was just being dramatic. But there was nothing funny about it now. What if she had ignored him for longer? What if she hadn't decided to take the test? The one thing that had led her to uncover the truth. She had almost failed to listen to him, almost allowed her own stubbornness to put them both in danger. The guilt hit her hard. It was as if she had betrayed him, and now she was left with the weight of that knowledge. The house, the sanctuary, the dream of a new start. It had nearly killed her. The thought made Emma shudder. She couldn't escape it. She had been living in a death trap, unaware of the invisible toxic threat lurking within the walls she had trusted. And yet, it wasn't just the house that had betrayed her. It was her own lack of awareness, her own reluctance to listen to Buddy when he needed her the most. For weeks, Buddy had been desperately trying to warn her, and she had dismissed him. The realization made her feel sick to her stomach. How could she have ignored him for so long? But now, standing in the cold night air with Buddy by her side, Emma realized that she had been given a second chance that so many others didn't get. The inspector's words still rang in her ears, but now they were less about fear and more about a harsh truth. They were lucky. So many others hadn't been. Radon gas claimed lives every year, silently and without warning. And it wasn't just the people who lived in the houses that were at risk. Even the pets, especially dogs, who had a heightened sense of smell, were often the first to react to the gas. They could sense the danger long before anyone else had a clue. And it wasn't just an inconvenience, it was deadly. Emma swallowed hard, trying to push the rising panic back down. She couldn't let herself spiral. She needed to focus. She needed to take the next step. But how could she move forward, knowing how close she had come to losing everything? How could she go back to normal when her world had been so violently shaken? Buddy's soft whimper broke through her thoughts again. She turned to him, her eyes filled with gratitude and sadness. He was lying quietly in the back seat, his head resting on the window as if the weight of everything had settled on him too. Emma's heart swelled with emotion as she thought of all they had been through together. He had been her companion through thick and thin, always by her side, always willing to protect her. And now he had saved her life. She reached back to scratch behind his ears, and he shifted slightly, lifting his head to look at her. His eyes were soft, and for the first time in days, Emma saw the familiar warmth that she had once known. It was as if Buddy too was beginning to process the relief, the knowledge that they had made it out of the worst of it. His tail wagged slightly, and Emma allowed herself a soft smile. She could never repay him for what he had done, but in that moment, it didn't matter. All that mattered was that they were both alive, and they had the chance to move forward. But that didn't mean she could forget what had almost happened. She couldn't let the gravity of the situation fade into the background, not when so many people, so many families were living in houses with radon leaks they didn't even know about. Emma had to do something. She couldn't just let this go. Her thoughts turned to the radon testing kit. She had learned so much from that small, unassuming box. She had learned that radon was a silent killer, a danger that most people didn't even know existed. And the more she thought about it, the more she realized that she couldn't just keep this knowledge to herself. If she had been living in the dark, how many others were too? How many people were unknowingly breathing in toxic air, unaware that their homes were silently poisoning them? Emma felt a fire ignite inside her. She had to do something. She had to raise awareness, to make sure others didn't have to go through what she and Buddy had endured. It wasn't just about her anymore. It was about everyone. The thought of speaking out, of sharing her story, terrified Emma. What if no one listened? What if people didn't believe her? What if she was seen as overreacting? But the more she thought about it, the clearer it became. She couldn't stay silent. She couldn't sit back and let this happen to other families, other pets. If there was any way to prevent someone else from facing the same terrifying reality she had to try. The decision was made in that moment. Emma would turn her near-death experience into something that could save lives. She would expose the dangers of radon gas, raise awareness, and make sure people understood the risks. She would share her story with the world, no matter how difficult it might be. It wasn't just about her anymore. It was about all the people and animals who were unknowingly living in danger, just like she had been. As Emma drove through the streets, Buddy by her side, she felt a sense of determination she hadn't known in weeks. The road ahead wouldn't be easy, but it was the right road. She couldn't let what happened to her be in vain. She had to fight for others, just like Buddy had fought for her. And somehow, despite the fear, despite the unknowns, Emma knew she was ready to face whatever came next, ready to turn her nightmare into something that could save lives. Emma stood in the quiet of her friend's living room, Buddy curled up beside her on the couch, his soft breathing the only sound filling the space. It had been a few days since they had escaped the house, and the weight of everything that had happened still hung over her. The world she had known, the life she had been so eager to start anew, had been shattered, replaced with a harrowing truth that she could barely comprehend. But as she gazed down at Buddy, her heart filled with gratitude, mixed with a sense of guilt she couldn't shake. He had saved them both. In his own way, he had been the hero of their story. Her phone buzzed beside her, snapping her from her thoughts. It was a reminder from the investigative journalism group she had joined a few months ago, prompting her to look at her emails and messages. Emma had been so consumed with everything happening in her life that she had pushed her work to the side. But now, with the truth about the radon gas weighing on her, she knew what needed to be done. She had a story to tell, a story that wasn't just hers but one that could save countless lives. As Emma began to sift through her emails, her fingers trembling slightly, a part of her hesitated. She had no idea how people would respond. What if they didn't take her seriously? What if they accused her of overreacting, of not understanding the danger she had lived through? The doubts lingered, but they were fleeting. The more she thought about it, the clearer it became. She had to share her story, no matter how terrifying or vulnerable it made her feel. She had to warn others, to make sure no one else had to go through what she and Buddy had endured. Her mind raced back to that fateful night, when Buddy had first started growling at the corner of the living room. She had been so quick to dismiss him, to laugh it off as a dog being dramatic, as a strange quirk of his behavior. But he hadn't been dramatic. He had been desperate, trying to warn her, trying to save her from something she couldn't see. And in the end, Buddy had been the one to show her the truth. Emma's eyes stung with tears as she thought about how close she had come to losing everything, how she had almost failed him. But now she knew she couldn't fail him again. The investigation into the radon gas leak was far from over. Emma had learned that radon wasn't just a problem in her house. It was a widespread issue affecting homes all over the country, with millions of people unknowingly breathing in toxic air. She couldn't stop thinking about the countless families, the pets, the children who had no idea that they were living in a danger zone. It was one thing to experience it firsthand, but it was something entirely different to know that others were still out there, unaware of the risk they were facing. Emma grabbed her phone, typing out an email to her journalism group. She had decided that she wasn't going to wait. She couldn't afford to wait. The people needed to know. Her hands shook as she typed, the words flowing out faster than she could keep up. She told her story, how she had bought the house in good faith, how everything had seemed perfect at first, and how Buddy had been the first to sense the danger. She described the growing fear she had felt as she watched him grow more and more agitated, and how she had finally come to realize that the threat wasn't paranormal, but something far more insidious. She explained the radon test, how the readings had been off the charts, and how, if she hadn't acted, she could have died. Emma hit send before she had a chance to second-guess herself. The email was out there now. It was real. There was no turning back. She sat back, her breath coming in shallow gasps as she waited for a response. Would anyone care? Would anyone listen? Or would her story be just another forgotten tale in the whirlwind of today's news cycle? But the response came quicker than she expected. Her inbox was flooded with replies, some supportive, some curious, some skeptical. The skepticism stung, but Emma understood. People didn't want to believe something as dangerous as radon could be lurking in their homes, silently killing them. But that was exactly why Emma had to speak out. She couldn't let this happen to anyone else. One of the replies stood out among the rest. It was from a journalist she had admired for years, a respected writer who had reported on environmental issues for decades. The email was short but impactful. It read, "This is exactly the type of story the world needs to hear. Let's talk. I want to help you get this information out there." A wave of relief washed over Emma as she read the message again, her pulse quickening. This was it. This was the moment she had been waiting for. Someone believed her. Someone with influence, with the ability to amplify her voice, wanted to help. She immediately replied, setting up a meeting for the next day. That night, Emma sat down with Buddy, who had now curled up beside her on the couch. He was calmer than he had been in weeks, his breathing steady, his body relaxed. She ran her hand through his fur, taking comfort in the soft, rhythmic sound of his breathing. He had been through so much, had endured so much, and yet here he was, still by her side, still loyal and steadfast. Emma couldn't help but wonder how he had known what was happening before she had. He had sensed the danger when she had been oblivious, and now, as they moved forward together, she vowed to make sure that his heroism didn't go unnoticed. The meeting with the journalist the next day felt like the beginning of something bigger. It was one thing to share her story with a small group of people, but to have it shared with a larger audience on a platform that could reach thousands, even millions, was something else entirely. Emma could feel the weight of the responsibility settling in her chest, but it was a responsibility she had willingly accepted. She couldn't let her story be a one-time thing. It had to be the beginning of a movement. It had to spark a change, raise awareness, and get people to take action. The journalist listened intently as Emma spoke, asking questions, digging deeper into the details of her experience. She talked about the radon gas, about how little people knew about the dangers it posed, and about the need for more widespread testing in homes. As Emma spoke, she could see the journalist's eyes light up with understanding, with the same passion that had driven Emma to share her story in the first place. This was not just a story about a woman and her dog. This was about an invisible threat that had the potential to harm millions of people, and she wasn't going to let it continue unchecked. After the meeting, Emma felt a surge of hope. The article would be written, the story would be told, and maybe, just maybe, people would listen. Maybe this would be the spark that would push for greater awareness, greater action. Maybe it would change the way people thought about their homes, their air, and their safety. The next few weeks were a whirlwind. The article was published, and the response was overwhelming. It wasn't just people from her town. People from all over the country were reaching out, sharing their own stories of radon exposure, asking for help, and thanking Emma for bringing the issue to light. People were finally paying attention. The story was being shared, retweeted, and talked about on every news outlet. Emma had become an unexpected spokesperson for a cause she hadn't even known existed just a few months ago. But through it all, there was Buddy. He was with her every step of the way. His quiet strength, a constant reminder of the bond they shared. The dog who had saved her life had now helped save the lives of countless others, and Emma couldn't help but smile as she watched him sleep soundly beside her that night. She had started out looking for a home, a fresh start, but what she had found was something far more important, a purpose. And with Buddy by her side, there was no turning back. She would continue to fight, continue to raise awareness, and continue to honor the dog who had become her hero. Tears welled up in Emma's eyes as she knelt beside Buddy, who was lying on the floor with his head resting on his paws, his eyes gentle and knowing. His fur, once matted and thick with tension, now gleamed with the softness of a dog who had been through so much, yet had so much love to give. Emma ran her fingers through his coat, feeling the warmth of his body, the steady rhythm of his breathing. This simple act of comfort, this small gesture carried so much weight. It was more than just a moment of connection between owner and pet. It was a reminder of how close she had come to losing him. "How did you know, Buddy?" Emma whispered, her voice barely audible, thick with emotion. "How did you know all of this was happening before I did? Why didn't I listen to you sooner?" The words broke her heart as they left her lips. The guilt was suffocating. She had been so blind, so caught up in her own life, her own plans, that she hadn't seen the truth until it was almost too late. She had ignored Buddy's frantic growls, his desperate behavior, assuming it was nothing more than an overactive imagination. And now, with the weight of everything that had transpired settling heavily on her chest, Emma couldn't stop replaying the events in her mind, the moments when she had dismissed him, when she had told herself that it was all in his head, when she had been too proud, too caught up in her own skepticism to listen. But Buddy had been right. He had been trying to save her all along. The realization hit her like a wave, crashing over her with the force of a storm. He had known, and yet she had almost failed him. She had almost let him down in the most catastrophic way possible. And for what? For her own pride. For the illusion that everything was fine. The guilt of almost ignoring Buddy, of almost letting this invisible danger, this radon gas that could have taken both their lives, consume them, weighed heavily on Emma. She had always thought of herself as someone who was in control, someone who could handle anything life threw at her. But the events of the past few weeks had shattered that illusion. The house, which had once been a symbol of new beginnings, had become a trap, a death trap. Radon gas had slowly been filling the space, poisoning the very air they breathed, and Emma hadn't known. She hadn't seen it. It was the hardest truth to accept, that she had been completely unaware, completely vulnerable, while Buddy had been fighting against an enemy that neither of them could see. Emma's hand trembled as she gently stroked Buddy's head, tears streaming down her face. The love she felt for him was overwhelming. It wasn't just the love of an owner for a pet. It was the love of a life saved, a bond that had withstood the test of danger and fear. "I'm so sorry, Buddy," Emma whispered, her voice breaking. "I'm so sorry I didn't listen. I almost lost you. I almost lost both of us." Buddy, ever the gentle soul, lifted his head and nuzzled her hand, his warm breath against her skin a comforting reminder that all was not lost. He didn't hold it against her. He never had. He had forgiven her long ago, and now, in this moment, as the weight of her regret finally began to subside, Emma could feel the depth of their bond more strongly than ever before. He had saved her, and now it was her turn to make sure they both got through this together. The guilt lingered, but Emma knew she couldn't dwell on it. They had made it out of the house alive, and that was what mattered. But still, the knowledge that she had nearly ignored Buddy's warnings haunted her. The thought that she could have dismissed him, that she might have stayed in that house without ever realizing the danger, was unbearable. If she had waited just a little longer, if she had continued to brush off his behavior, things might have ended differently. The inspector's words echoed in her mind. "If you had stayed another week, you'd be dead." And then the harsh reality hit her even harder. It wasn't just her life that had been at risk, it was Buddy's too. He had been exposed to the same deadly gas, the same invisible threat. The thought of losing him, of having to live with the knowledge that he had suffered in silence, just as she had, was too much to bear. She had been so focused on protecting herself, on figuring out what was going wrong, that she had failed to see how Buddy was suffering too. It wasn't just the growls or the frantic scratching at the door. It was the toll it had taken on him, the way he had suffered in the midst of something he couldn't even understand. Emma squeezed her eyes shut, trying to push the overwhelming emotions aside, but they crashed over her in waves. She felt like she was drowning in them, and it took everything she had not to let them pull her under. "I almost failed him," she thought again. "I almost let him down." But then, as if sensing her distress, Buddy moved closer, resting his head on her lap. His presence was a grounding force, a reminder that they had survived this together. He had forgiven her, and now it was time for her to forgive herself. She had made mistakes, yes, but she was here. She had been given a second chance, and she would honor it. She would not let the guilt consume her. "I'll make it right, buddy," she whispered through her tears. "I promise I'll make it right." And she meant it with every fiber of her being. The road ahead would be long, and it would require all the strength she could muster, but she would find a way to use her experience to help others. She couldn't undo the past, but she could ensure that it didn't happen to anyone else. And Buddy, her hero, her savior, would be by her side through it all. As Emma sat there, holding Buddy in the stillness of the evening, she knew that this was a turning point. She had seen the darkness, had faced the terrifying truth that the world was not always as safe as it seemed, but she had also seen the light, had felt the warmth of Buddy's unwavering love and loyalty. She had been given a second chance, and she would use it wisely. The guilt would never fully leave her, but it would serve as a reminder of what really mattered. It was a lesson she would carry with her for the rest of her life. Never ignore the signs, never dismiss the warnings, and never take for granted the love and loyalty that was right in front of her. With a deep breath, Emma stood up, wiping the last of her tears away. She looked down at Buddy, her heart swelling with a mixture of love and determination. "We've got work to do, Buddy," she said softly, her voice steady now, her resolve clear. "We're going to make sure people know about this. We're going to make sure no one else has to go through what we did." Buddy gave a soft woof, as if in agreement, and Emma couldn't help but smile. There was a new fire in her, a new purpose that burned brighter than the regret she had once felt. They were a team, and together, they were unstoppable. Emma sat in the quiet of her living room, her laptop open in front of her, the cursor blinking on the blank screen. Buddy was lying at her feet, as he had been for the last few hours, his gentle snoring the only sound in the room. The weight of the past few weeks still lingered in the air, but it was no longer the suffocating pressure of fear and uncertainty. Now it was something different, something heavier, but also more purposeful. Emma had seen the darkness. She had felt the cold grip of danger that had nearly consumed her, and with it, a fire had been lit inside her. She had been given a second chance, something so many people never got, and she knew she couldn't waste it. She couldn't just walk away and pretend nothing had happened. The house, the radon, Buddy's desperate attempts to protect her, it had all led to something bigger, something far more important than she had initially realized. The idea had taken root in her mind, slowly at first, and then growing stronger with each passing day. She couldn't just tell her story and walk away. No, she had a responsibility now, not just to herself or to Buddy, but to every other person who could be unknowingly living in the same silent danger she had faced. The house had nearly taken everything from her, and it wasn't just her story to tell. It was the story of thousands of families, of countless others who had no idea that they were breathing in toxic air, and they didn't even know it. The thought of it made her blood run cold. What if there were other people, other pets, out there suffering in silence, because they didn't know about the danger? The more Emma thought about it, the clearer her purpose became. She had to do something. She had to make sure that no one else had to endure what she had. She had to raise awareness. The path ahead was uncertain, and the idea of diving headfirst into a campaign for radon awareness was daunting. But Emma couldn't ignore the responsibility she felt. She had been given this second chance for a reason, and this was her reason. Her heart swelled with determination as she stared at the blank screen. She had no idea how to begin, but she knew that starting was the first step. The words would come. The ideas would come. She pulled her phone from her pocket, scrolling through her contacts. She had connected with so many people over the past few weeks, journalists, experts, and others who had been involved in environmental causes. She couldn't do this alone. She needed help. She needed to make sure this message got to the right people, the people who could make a real difference. It was time to start building the network that would help her spread the word about the dangers of radon gas. She couldn't sit back and wait for someone else to do it. She had to take charge, and she would. Emma tapped out a quick message to the journalist she had met with before. the one who had agreed to help her tell her story. She needed their expertise, their guidance. She needed to turn her experience into something actionable, something that could create change. She needed to get this information out into the world, to every household, to every pet owner, to everyone who could be affected. Her phone buzzed almost immediately in response. The journalist was ready to help, eager to start working on the campaign. Emma's pulse quickened with excitement. This was it. This was the moment when things would start to change. The fire inside her burned brighter now, fueled by the determination to make sure that no one else had to live in a house that was silently killing them. No one else should have to ignore the warning signs, as she had. As Emma continued to write, her mind drifted back to that night when everything had started to unravel. The night she had finally listened to Buddy's frantic cries. The night she had realized that the danger wasn't imaginary, wasn't something to laugh off. She had been so close to ignoring the truth, to dismissing him as just another dog with irrational fears. But Buddy had saved her. He had seen the threat before she had, and now she knew she had to honor his efforts, his loyalty, and his bravery. She would not let this go. Every part of her story was important. Every detail mattered. The way Buddy had been acting out, the way he had tried to warn her even when she didn't understand, was just the beginning. It wasn't just the dog's behavior. It was the invisible killer that had been creeping through the walls of her home, filling the very air she breathed. Radon. It had been there all along, silently waiting for her to realize the danger. It wasn't just a story of a woman and her dog. It was the story of how an invisible deadly threat could infiltrate even the safest of places, and how, without proper knowledge, anyone could fall victim to it. Emma's fingers flew across the keyboard as she began drafting the outline of her campaign. It was going to be a big undertaking. There was so much work ahead, gathering data, finding experts, connecting with organizations, and getting the word out to the public. But she was ready. She had to be. Her mission was clear, and she would stop at nothing to see it through. No one else should have to live in the same fear, in the same ignorance, that she had. As Emma worked, she couldn't help but glance down at Buddy. He was sleeping soundly now, his body curled up in a tight ball, his chest rising and falling with each peaceful breath. He had been through so much, so many sleepless nights, so much fear, so much tension, but now he was calm, content, and safe. The sight of him, peaceful and free from the anxiety that had gripped him for so long, filled Emma's heart with an overwhelming sense of gratitude. She had nearly lost him. She had nearly failed him, but now they were in this together, and whatever came next, they would face it side by side. Emma sat back in her chair, taking a deep breath as she thought about the road ahead. It wasn't going to be easy. The awareness campaign, the articles, the public speaking, it would all take time, effort, and persistence. But she wasn't afraid anymore. She had lived through the nightmare, and now she had the power to make sure others didn't have to. She had a purpose, and she wasn't about to let anything stand in her way. Her phone buzzed again, pulling her from her thoughts. Another email from the journalist, this time with a list of contacts, environmental organizations, radon testing services, experts in the field, who could lend their support to the cause. Emma's heart raced with anticipation. This was the beginning, the first step in a long journey that would lead to something bigger than she could have imagined. The words were there now, all of them. The ideas, the passion, the story. It was time to turn it into action. Time to spread the message. Time to save lives. As Emma stood up, stretching her stiff muscles, she looked down at Buddy once more. "We're going to do this, Buddy," she whispered, her voice filled with resolve. "We're going to make sure people know. We're going to make sure they listen." And as Buddy's tail thumped softly against the floor, Emma felt a renewed sense of purpose fill her chest. There was no turning back now. They were on a mission, and with Buddy by her side, there was nothing that could stop them. Emma stood in the doorway of her old house, a strange mix of emotions swirling within her. The house that had once felt like a fresh start, a place where she could build a new life, now felt like a distant memory, a place that had nearly taken everything from her. The house was still standing, the same familiar structure that had welcomed her months ago, but to Emma, It no longer felt like home. The shadows that had once seemed charming, the creaks of the floorboards that had once whispered warmth, now felt suffocating, oppressive. The house had changed her. It had tested her, pushed her to her limits, and almost taken her life. But it had also saved her life. It had pushed her to listen, to act, and to make a difference. She looked over at Buddy, who stood beside her, his body still and quiet, his tail wagging slowly as if he too understood the significance of this moment. He had saved her, not just once, but time and time again. It wasn't just the radon that had put them both in danger. It was the way that everything had aligned, the way Buddy's instinct and loyalty had led her to the truth when she could no longer see it. But the house, the place that had almost become their tomb, was also the catalyst for something greater. It had set everything in motion. Without the radon, without Buddy's desperate warnings, she might never have found her purpose. She would never have become the voice for others who were unknowingly living with the same silent threat. The house had pushed her to the edge of fear, regret, and guilt, and in doing so, it had also given her the strength to fight. It had forced her to stop running from the hard truths, to face what was really happening, and in the end, it had given her the most important thing she could have ever hoped for, an opportunity to change things. Looking around at the house, Emma's thoughts drifted back to the first night she had moved in, when everything had seemed so perfect. She had been so eager to start fresh, to put her past behind her and create a life that felt stable and secure. The house had been beautiful, full of character, full of history. The wallpaper, though peeling in places, had a vintage charm. The hardwood floors, though worn, had a rich patina that seemed to tell stories of lives lived before her. She had seen it as a haven, a refuge from the chaos she had left behind, but she had never expected it to be the one thing that could almost destroy everything. The first sign of something wrong had been subtle. The way Buddy had started growling at that corner in the living room. She had brushed it off, called him dramatic, thinking it was just a dog's fear of a new place. But it wasn't. And as the days went on, Emma had pushed her concerns aside, telling herself that it was nothing, that it was just the house settling. But deep down she knew. She had known something wasn't right. She had just refused to see it, and it had nearly cost her. Now standing in the doorway, Emma could still hear the frantic scratching at the bedroom door, Buddy's growls echoing through the silence of the house. She could still feel the oppressive weight of the air, the suffocating atmosphere that had filled the room as the radon slowly seeped in, poisoning them both. It had taken Buddy's instinct, his desperation, his unwavering loyalty to bring her to the truth. Without him, she would have never known what was happening. Without him, she might have stayed there, unaware of the danger, until it was too late. The inspector's words still echoed in her mind. If you had stayed another week, you'd be dead. That was the moment Emma realized just how close she had come to losing everything. It wasn't just her life at stake, it was Buddy's too. The guilt of almost ignoring him, of almost dismissing his warnings, sat like a stone in her chest. But she had survived. They had survived. And it wasn't just by chance. It was because Buddy had fought for their lives, because he had refused to back down, even when Emma had been too stubborn, too blind to see what was happening. Emma reached down, running her fingers through Buddy's fur, and the guilt she had carried for so long began to dissipate. Buddy had forgiven her long ago, and now, it was time for her to forgive herself. They had both made it out. They had both been given a second chance. The journey hadn't been easy. It had been painful and uncertain, filled with moments of doubt, fear, and frustration. But it had also been transformative. Emma had gone from being a woman trying to rebuild her life, to a woman with a mission. She had found a purpose that was bigger than her own story. She had shared her experience, her near-death escape, with the world, and it had resonated with people. It had sparked a conversation, one that was long overdue, about the dangers of radon gas, and the importance of testing for it. Emma had become the face of a movement, one that aimed to raise awareness, to save lives, and to make sure that no one else had to endure the same terror she had. And through it all, Buddy had been there by her side. He had been her guide, her protector, her source of strength. He had never wavered in his loyalty, even when she had doubted him. Even when she had tried to shut him out, he had been there. still barking, still growling, still trying to save her. In the end, it was Buddy who had saved them both, and it was his bravery, his unwavering love and dedication, that had given Emma the courage to face the truth. But now, with the campaign launched, with the articles written, with the awareness spreading like wildfire, Emma could finally breathe a sigh of relief. They had made it. They had made a difference. The house that had once nearly been their tomb had now become the symbol of their survival, their triumph. It was a reminder of what they had overcome, and it would never be forgotten. As Emma stood there, taking in the familiar sights of the house one last time, she knew that this chapter was closing, but it wasn't the end. The work was far from over. Radon gas was still a silent killer, still claiming lives every year, and the fight to raise awareness would continue. But Emma was no longer the same woman who had walked into this house months ago. She had been tested, shaped and strengthened by the journey. She had faced her fears, confronted the unknown, and emerged victorious. And now, with Buddy by her side, she was ready for whatever came next. The future was uncertain, but one thing was clear: she would keep fighting. She would keep spreading the message, keep raising awareness, keep making sure that people understood the importance of testing their homes for radon. She couldn't let anyone else go through what she had. She couldn't let anyone else ignore the signs until it was too late. As the sun set on the horizon, casting a warm golden glow over the house, Emma took one last look around, feeling a sense of closure and peace wash over her. The house had almost taken everything from her, but in the end it had given her everything she needed. It had given her a purpose, a mission, and most importantly, it had given her Buddy, the dog who had saved her life, the dog who had shown her the way, the dog who had given her the courage to stand up and fight. Together they had faced the darkness, and together they had brought the light.